Welcome to the Truth Expedition. I'm your host, Mark Bischofsky. This is the very first episode of the Truth Expedition. On this show, we are going to scratch and claw and dig and pry and try to find some tangible truths in this crazy world full of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, you name it. So for those of you that aren't familiar with who is Mark Bischofsky, I'm a regular guy. Became an activist in 2021. I'm a respiratory therapist, worked in the healthcare field for a couple decades, started asking a lot of questions. Actually, I've been skeptical and not trusting politicians in government since 9/11, to tell you the truth, and been trying to question everything. And, you know, I've recently been saying that 2 + 2 = 4. That's a truth to me. But beyond that, it's really hard to find truth. And on any number of subjects, I believe there is a truth, but to get to that truth becomes more and more difficult every day. Here's an example. The Ontario Mathematics Coordinators Association says, they told their social media followers, that saying 2 + 2 = 4 is part of a white Western mathematics that marginalizes other possible values. This is 1984 Orwellian. So trying to find truth becomes almost impossible. I believe masks don't work. A whole segment of the population believes they do work. I don't believe that these COVID vaccines are safe and effective. I don't even believe they're vaccines. But again, a whole segment of the population believes they're safe and effective, and they can't wait to get their next booster. Among 1,000 other things, the Federal Reserve being a scam, JFK, 9/11, Oklahoma City bombing. I have come to a point in my life where I am questioning everything. So I couldn't be more excited about this opportunity here in Roseville at Action for Liberty Studios to be able to use this studio, invite amazing guests on to talk about current affairs and subjects that we're all interested in, politics, science, environment, you name it. This is my first guest today, unbelievable, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman got his BS in molecular biology from MIT, studied medicine at South Carolina University. He's a psychiatrist, does training at Duke. He's been blowing the whistle on this whole COVID scamdemic. And more importantly, he's one of the world's most prominent voices on terrain theory or debating the existence of germ theory. So that's a big pill for a lot of people to swallow, that viruses may not even exist. And so this discussion is going to be amazing, and I can't wait to get into it with Dr. Andrew Kaufman. So thank you very much. We're going to be having the show every Monday, 7 p.m. So tell your friends, follow on rumble.com/thetruthexpedition, and enjoy this episode, this very first exploration that we're about to have with Dr. Andrew Kaufman. My guest today got his Bachelor of Science in Molecular Biology from MIT, studied medicine at the University of South Carolina, got his training in psychiatry at Duke University. He's done work in forensic psychology, oncology, other areas of medicine. He's an inventor, a COVID whistleblower, a homeschool consultant, a truth seeker, and a freedom fighter. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time today, Dr. Kaufman. It is a pleasure.
No problem. I enjoy meeting new people and especially others with similar paths in life.
Yeah, so speaking of that path, how does a guy like yourself go from, probably mainstream doctor prescribing medications to somebody who literally questioning everything? How does this happen?
Well, I think I've always kind of questioned things, maybe not everything, not as deep as I have recently, but I just really observed from my own experience and that of my peers as I was learning to practice medicine, as well as learning how to evaluate the research. In fact, it was really at Duke University in my residency where they strongly emphasized what they called a critical appraisal of the literature. And for the first year of my residency, it was actually, I think the first 2 years, it was required to attend this weekly seminar. And each time, we would be given, several of the residents would be assigned to a paper. And we would use this particular format. And we, of course, one of the main emphasis was on the methods of the research, like how was the experiment actually conducted and how was the data analyzed, because we were mostly looking at clinical research in psychiatry. And of course, that is clinical research where they use statistical analysis to show, the differences between a treatment group and a placebo group, for example. So we had to also learn about statistics. So we had a separate course on that, which was very enlightening to see how much trickery can be done there. And most doctors have very limited or no understanding of how this analysis works. And so when they read things, it's very difficult to interpret. So I was very lucky. And I think I really chose Duke because they had this sort of evidence-based focus. But I realized that there was also hypocrisy, because we would be attending this seminar, and there was one pinnacle where we read an article where it was actually a statistician had applied through the Freedom of Information Act to obtain data that was submitted to the FDA to approve antidepressants, but the data that wasn't published, right? Because when they do a study, they only publish it if it has a positive outcome, right? So if it shows the drug is beneficial, they would publish it. If it shows there's no benefit or if there's even harm, they won't publish it. But they're still required to submit at least some of that data to the FDA. So this analysis included that unpublished data, which really represents all of the evidence, and analyzed it in what's called a meta-analysis, where you can combine different data sets together into one. And it's a very powerful tool to look at the entire or a larger body of research. And what was found is that there was no significant difference at all in the outcomes for antidepressants between placebo and treatment group when all the data is looked together. And so, it's like on a Monday morning, we analyze this and we all come to the conclusion, we're like, oh, well, antidepressants don't really work. And then an hour later, we're in the clinic and our supervisors are telling us to prescribe antidepressants. So that hypocrisy was uncomfortable. And as I was able to practice more and more independently, completing my training, I saw, through my own experience, I'd had enough cases by that point to see that they weren't getting better from these drugs. And in fact, the drugs were causing harm in several ways. And, some of those I would observe directly, and some I have just known about through the research. And some of these drugs, by the way, actually cause sudden death, something we've seen an escalation of in the last couple of years. But antipsychotics specifically, there's a large study from Tennessee looking at all Medicaid recipients who are prescribed it, and these are mostly teenagers with behavior problems. And there was a significant amount of just sudden death. And, you never see that in teenagers. So over time, I began to be more and more conservative about using medicines. And, one of the principal reasons they hire a psychiatrist is really just to be a prescriber. And all kinds of facilities need that in order to maintain their license, like jails, prisons, detention centers, residential facilities, and such, or their funding is tied to having a psychiatric prescriber. But I ended up at the end of that portion of my career really just tapering people off medicines, because patients came to me already sometimes on multiple medications, and they were, and I observed some amazing things doing this. Like, people emerged back, their true personality came out. Many of them had huge growth spurts because these are children and their growth was retarded by the drugs. And so through this process and through becoming aware of some other pioneers who spoke the truth about this, like Kelly Brogan was a very early influence on me, and Dr. Jennifer Daniels as well. I was able to, first of all, once I realized truly how harmful these drugs were, I could no longer really keep patients on them. So I was always taking them off. But I also realized I couldn't really do the right thing in terms of educating and working with individuals who are suffering in that system, because it required you to do things that were harmful. And this is, how I began slowly making my way out. And then the, plandemic shock to the world really kind of catapulted me to the next step to actually, take the plunge and leave. And my hand was sort of forced just because I resisted, of course, any of the tyrannical rules that were my former employer tried to impose upon me.
Yeah, amazing story. So was that about the time 2020? When did you dig in? So for the viewers out there, Dr. Kaufman has the stance, really professes a theory called terrain theory, and that viruses may not exist, which, to some people just seems out of this world. How could this be possible? But is that, is the plandemic and this whole scam, is that what got you to dig into whether or not viruses exist?
Well, it's kind of interesting how in life sometimes we experience, what most refer to as coincidences that prepare us for a moment in time. And so looking back, there were two things that occurred at the end of 2019 for me that were really helped me uncover what was going on very quickly and early on in the pandemic. One of those was I just had been preparing for about a year to speak publicly and criticize medicine. And I had done this at some small conferences before, specifically in psychiatry, but this was bigger. I was going to talk about vaccines and oncology, chemotherapy. And so I started doing that. And of course, not too many people paid attention at that time, but I still was comfortable being in, risking certain controversial information publicly that, could even come back on my career. So I was willing to, change my career to accommodate that. And the second thing was just by chance almost, I began looking into germ theory in December of 2019. And I saw actually a podcast with Bear Lando and Mike Winter talking about a book about Antoine Béchamp and Louis Pasteur. And so that set me on a path to sort of start questioning, the infectious theory of disease, right, where microorganisms cause disease. And I hadn't fully understood or evaluated everything, but when there were murmurs of this, Wuhan virus, quote unquote, I began looking into that, and I quickly realized that, it's actually a little bit worse than you say. It's not that there may not be viruses, it's actually that there's zero evidence of viruses existing. There's a theory, there's lots of simulations and inferential opinions or pieces of information that are kind of used to bring about the appearance that this is real. But if you just simply apply logic and the scientific method and look at what they're doing, like I apply the same principles of critical appraisal that I learned, at Duke University and from others, and including, a mentor that later on helped me learn how to do my own statistical analysis. I actually was one of the few physicians who, would write code in SPSS to analyze data from my own research. And I was applying the same principles to looking at these papers claiming to discover viruses, and found that it was, complete fraud and sham in terms of what is real and what is science. And of course, it's still very controversial because it hits us at a very root level, and we've all experienced illness, and we've experienced it with this kind of claim that we were told since we were very, very young about contagion and about, bugs and germs making us sick. And we never really looked at the scientific studies that could easily demonstrate that. I mean, it's amazing because I, of course, look back further in history to other viruses. I mean, even early on, I tried to find the original coronavirus paper. And I did ultimately find it. It was from like the 1950s, and it was in a veterinary journal. Someone who was a librarian had to get a copy of this for me. It was really hard to to find, and it was it was all just a sham. It was all indirect, inferential evidence, no direct evidence. And then I found out about contagion studies, right? Because this idea that we harbor these germs and they come out of us in our secretions or our breath, and that's how other people get sick. And turns out they actually did all these studies trying to demonstrate that, and they couldn't get anybody sick.
Right. And that's as far back as like even the Spanish flu, correct? I mean,
Yeah,
they
yeah.
really
Well,
could not infect people.
the U.S. Public Health Service, right, which is like the body that established the CDC, and it predates the CDC, but it's the public health agent branch of the United States government. And they sponsored the studies in the Spanish flu, and there were a whole slew of studies, animal studies and human studies, right? Where they got these people from the Spanish flu wards, and they got them to cough and sneeze and all of this stuff, and they exposed the people to it every which way, right? Because they did it one way, the way they thought it naturally spread, and then no one got sick, and so they did more and more severe things to try and spread the illness, and they just couldn't spread it, not even to one single person. And there's many studies that have been done since then, including this one study with looking at colds, and they had a control group where they just injected saline into their nose, and then another group where they injected snot from people with colds, up their nose, and that more people got colds in the group with saline. So, and they've done this even for STDs as well.
Yeah.
So, and they've never, ever been able to demonstrate just a simple contagion. So it's like almost, that in and of itself proves that germs are not what's making us sick. But there's much, much more, evidence than that. So, the more I look into what's behind medical science and biology and even spreading out into other areas of science, the more I see that some of these main narratives are completely false, or there's lacking evidence behind them.
Yeah, it's, and I can attest to this because, as a respiratory therapist, I worked with COVID patients in these rooms where they're aerosolizing, these high flow oxygen devices or BiPAPs. And I'm using an N95 for a week long, and it's falling off my face. I'm breathing this air and never got COVID during that time. But it's so, if there are no viruses, this is like the can of worms is so enormous when we're talking about what are these people then doing at these level 4 labs? What is the furin cleavage and the patent that Moderna has? It's like a whole population of scientists and doctors have been. Is this, in your opinion, intentional?
Well, I think you can answer that question quite simply on a basic level and just say, well, who's paying for all of that?
Yeah.
And what are they getting out of it? And you see that it's largely the vaccine industry, and they have special government protections, immunity from liability. So in other words, they can put whatever poison in there, and it can have whatever harm on individuals without them having to pay. Right? They just get profit, and it's we're talking about billions and billions of dollars just in the United States from vaccines, and that's what I think is going on. Is they're just developing, technology for vaccines, which is highly profitable, and of course I'm sure has other purposes as well, like to keep people ill,
Yeah.
at some level, so that they are prevented from ever realizing what's going on and rising up.
Yeah. So when I put out a message that I was going to be able to interview you, a lot of the questions that people wanted me to ask, what about polio? I believe with polio they just renamed different diseases. Chicken pox is the big one. That's where
Well,
people.
um, of course, I've talked, and my colleagues have, put out a lot of material on all these topics. But it's pretty easy um, to figure out what's going on when you really look at the research. And polio, I would definitely refer people to a book called "The Moth and the Iron Lung" by Forrest Moretti, because it shows excellent evidence that what was the polio epidemic, right? Which wasn't a completely new thing. Actually, poliomyelitis is a specific lesion of the spinal cord, and that's really what we're talking about here. The all of the stuff about the virus came later. They didn't, know what was the cause at the time, but through this intensive research that I'm talking about, you can see that it's actually insecticides that caused this, that matched the seasonal pattern, the timing, the vulnerable population had the biggest exposure. So it all really adds up. And originally it was lead arsenate was the main thing, and it has to do with the gypsy moth, and that's what the title of the book, The Moth and the Iron Lung, I believe the gypsy moth. And later on, for a period of a few years, it was lead arsenate was not used, and DDT was used. And there's actually some description of a slightly difference in the clinical presentation, but it caused similar spinal cord or neurologic lesions, paralysis, etc. And when those chemicals were stopped in widespread use, is when the polio changed. And of course, there was also a change in the definition. That made it have also a bigger appearance that it disappeared, and that was timed with when the first vaccines came on the market. But if you just break that down, you can see that polio went away before any vaccine was in widespread use, and the first the Salk vaccine actually caused a lot of paralysis, and they took it off the market quickly, and then it was several years later before the Sabin vaccine came on. And polio had disappeared by that time. If you just look at the data, it's available in the public. And then if you look at the other line of research on polio, which is said to establish that it's a virus in nature, one is they never actually found the virus, but they did these experiments that they say proved that it was contagious, or that it was caused by something. And they were pretty ridiculous, because they had essentially children who died of polio. They took the spinal cord out of the dead child and chopped it up in a blender, and they assumed it had a virus in it, right? But they didn't actually look in it or find a virus in it. They just assumed it was there, and then they gave that dead biological material to monkeys. And they said that the virus was in sewage water, like in the East River, and that it you drank it, like it came through the fecal oral route, or something, or through the oral route. And so they had them, swallow this material, and none of them got sick, of course. Then they tried injecting it, right, which doesn't happen in nature, right? Kids don't go around injecting each other with their feces or secretions or etc. But they still didn't get sick. So then they actually opened up their skull and injected this material directly into the brain. And they didn't do any control subjects where they injected spinal cord material from a child that died of another cause, like in a drowning accident or something. And then of course some of these animals got sick and some of them died, but they didn't develop spinal cord lesions that matched polio, right? They were, if you just take dead, sick tissue, rotting flesh, inject it in the brain of an animal, I mean, you could guess that probably it's not going to go well. Yeah. But this is given as the proof of this virus causing polio.
Right, and I've heard you explain it, and maybe explain it for the audience. I mean, basically how this whole PCR thing, they're putting stuff in a petri dish, and it's just this bath of dead cells and cellular material, and they're never really able to visualize, if I'm right there, visualize a virus, or maybe they're seeing an exosome or something.
Well, here's the main thing about PCR. PCR is just a technique used to really just amplify relatively short sequences of genetic material. And the problem is it can reliably do that. Like it's very good at doing that. It does introduce error, so you can sometimes find things that aren't there. So you have to do it very, very carefully in a very controlled way. But the main problem is with all of this is that in order to be able to utilize that, you have to know that the sequence that you're using the PCR to amplify, you have to know where that comes from. And you have to know that it's specific for a certain thing. And that evidence just doesn't exist anywhere. They just find it in humans. But there are many, many sources of genetic material in humans, right? Including human genetic material. And when you're talking about, if we look at genetic sequences, they're in organisms, right? They're very, very, very long. Even what they theorize that these imaginary viruses, that they have a strand of genetic material that's 30,000 bases long. Okay, and that's like the simplest form of life. So for humans, it's orders of magnitude longer than that. And of course, if you look at a strand that's 30,000 bases long, right? You know that that sequence, since it's so long, it's probably pretty unique. Like the chances of duplicating the exact sequence that's 30,000 long is very, very small. But what about one that is only 4 long? Like if we take only 4 base sequence, we could find it in every single organism that there is in the world, right?
Right.
Now, PCR generally uses primers and probes that are about 20 or 22 long. So it's more unique than 4, but it's going to be present in a lot of organisms. And if you put in these 22 base long sequences in like a big database online, like GISAID, and you can do this, and people have done this, you'll find that you'll get, it matches 100 or several hundred or 1,000 different organisms. So even if you could reliably detect just that sequence, in any given sample, how do you know which of those 100 organisms it might have come from?
Yeah.
Right? So this is, we could call this issue provenance or the origin, but we have to know for sure, right, that whatever we're using the PCR to look at, or any other test, antibody test, I mean, there's problems with all of these tests that are intrinsic in the test itself, but for it to be valid at all, you have to know that the material that the test is detecting or measuring, you have to know where that comes from and that it only comes from that source.
Yeah, so it brings to me the question of, so if this whole germ theory thing is wrong or a scam, do we have to then relook and rethink at what actually is the immune system? Is our understanding of what the immune system does and how it functions, is that another can of worms?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and if you look into various aspects of that, like like the role of antibodies, what are antibodies? Or what is the immune system really? You hear a lot, even in the space that we talk about, right? You hear people recommend to just boost your immune system. Well, I'd like to ask you, how do you single out your immune system and boost that? What about the rest of your body? All the other systems, right? Like we're an integrated whole organism. We need everything to be working in balance as a whole in order to experience health, optimal health and performance, vitality and emotional well-being, all the things that go into making us healthy. We can't just single out, one part of our body, right? I mean, imagine if you just tried to make, your index finger as healthy as possible.
Not possible.
At the expense of everything else, right? So one thing is we've got to think a bit more, holistically about health and about the body, that we're not just singling out little parts. But the immune system, the true role of it is, in my opinion, is quite different. And much this whole idea about it's a military operation, that we have killer cells and everything's about killing microorganisms is, that's just the evidence is not really there for that. So if we look at antibodies, because people are very familiar, they're used in a lot of tests, and they're said to be, they bind things very specifically. But it's actually not the case at all. They actually bind a lot of things. And this is very important because the body needs that ability to bind anything that's foreign to it that enters in the body, right? Because we all experience physical trauma where the barriers that protect the insides of our body are protected, right? Every time you get a little cut, scrape, nick, this is happening. And foreign material from outside in the environment then gets inside of our bodies, and it needs to be, cleaned up or sequestered because it could be dangerous to us. It could disrupt function. It could cause direct toxicity. I mean, think about like chemicals, for example, or or fecal material that may be in the dirt or on the floor, right? You don't want that inside your body. It's not good.
Yeah.
So antibodies need to be able to tag and bind up any substance that enters the body in order to protect the body. And now that's very similar to what we're told about the immune system, right? That it has a protective or a defensive role. But we're talking about here is like sequestration and labeling. We're not talking, that's more operations management rather than, aggressive defense weapons and killing.
Yeah, and I happen to agree with you 100% on this. And I was introduced to the terrain theory years ago, and natural health, these things. I think we might have one disagreement here, though, where I feel like, you could call this, whatever COVID-19 is, this set of symptoms, which some say, there isn't a set of symptoms. You could, to me, working at the bedside, and for 23 years up to that point, 22 years up to that point, working with pulmonary illnesses, seeing, 20 some odd flu seasons, people with pneumonia, I feel like whether it's from 5G or glyphosate toxicity or the stratospheric aerosol injection or something, I feel like there was a unique set of symptoms. For one thing,
well, let me, if I may interrupt you for
absolutely.
a second. So you just said, I feel like there's a unique, so that's a bit of difference than saying I have evidence that there's a unique set of symptoms, right? So is there evidence like that you have that there's a unique set of symptoms?
No.
And if so, like, what are they?
Well, no, that absolutely not. I'm not a scientist, but just let me run by you what I think
Well,
was
even from if you were, sounds like you were working as a respiratory therapist, like in an acute care setting during the onset of the pandemic, right?
correct.
So you could have evidence based on your own observation. I mean, that this is the first thing that we all should trust is our own observation.
Yeah.
We should be aware of our own biases, but that's where we get the idea that something might be different, and then we can test that by doing experiments or by looking at other experiments, right? But this is really, it's important because if we ignore our observations, we're going to be misled.
Yeah, so I feel like, the chest films were very unique with the ground glass whiteout on both sides. Typically during a flu season, you're going to have some pneumonias in one or the other lobe. That coupled with elevated D-dimers, and to me, most profound was this happy hypoxia, where people would come in with blood oxygen levels on pulse oximetry in the 70s, and that would be verifiable with an arterial blood gas. And these people would be really low oxygens, where historically every single time that somebody has a saturation even below, say, 82, they would be huffing and puffing. Their work of breathing, their respiratory rate would be escalated. These people were showing no symptoms, as if it were some kind of change in the way the red blood cell was presenting to the brain, saying I'm oxygenated, but it really wasn't. And that, and the losing the taste and smell, where I know that there's, historically that has happened. People lose their taste and smell, but typically that's not when you can breathe through your nose. In fact, my wife had lost her taste and smell before she got the brain tickler test. She had lost her taste and smell. She was sucking on an Altoid, and over the course of like 10 minutes, just couldn't taste it anymore. So, to me, those symptoms there, with, like I said, the elevated D-dimer, the chest films, the happy hypoxia, the loss of taste and smell, the way that these patients were presenting, to me, was unique. That's something I had never seen in my 23 years.
All right. So let me ask you a few questions. So one is, where were you practicing, and what was the time where you first had these observations?
I was in a critical care ICU, not a big hospital. I noticed these basically with the first patients that came in with the so-called COVID-19.
What part of the world?
Minnesota, United States.
Okay. And you're practicing in the ICU?
Correct.
Okay. So where were the patients before they got to you?
Oh, it was so insane. They were telling these patients to go home, come back when your lips turn blue. So they were coming to the emergency department and straight to the ICU.
Were they arriving by ambulance or walking in themselves?
I would say both.
Okay. And when they got to you, were they ventilated?
No, I was doing my very best to put off this ridiculous notion of early intubation. So we were trying high flow oxygen and.
And what treatment had they received before they got to you?
Literally nothing. I mean.
They got nothing in the ambulance, nothing in the ER?
Perhaps they were getting, supplemental oxygen. And at that point, if they needed fluids, they were giving IV fluids. A lot of these people were arriving with a lot of anxiety, so of course they're going to give anti-anxiety.
So now, in the prior years, during flu season, did you have a whole bunch of patients that came from the, ER directly to the ICU? Or
No.
They would get treatment in the ER, be further evaluated, maybe go to the floor?
Yeah, it was different the way they were treating people.
Okay. So that's one big thing, is they're being treated differently. And you got to look at, well, how does that affect the course of their illness? The other thing, within the treatment differently, you mentioned that the D-dimers were elevated. Now, is D-dimer a standard test that they would get on people with flu and pneumonia?
No, it isn't.
No. So you don't know what the D-dimers would have looked like in prior years.
Yeah, you're
Right.
absolutely right about this. I think the big one for me was the happy hypoxia, because that, as a respiratory therapist, that is something I had never seen before in my life.
Right. Well, I can explain that without further information, but, just in the different treatment, that could be, part of the reason. And also, like, one thing that it's really important to look into is, okay, what was generally going on right before all these patients started coming in?
Yeah, I'm not really.
So there was, like, the whole world was shut down. There was an announcement that millions were going to die, right? So have you heard of the nocebo effect?
Yes.
So do you know that in a published study, they did an experiment where they had patients with cancer, but they told them they were giving them chemotherapy, but they actually gave them saline. And they generally experienced, the acute side effects of chemo, like nausea, vomiting. But some of them actually lost their hair, and they weren't given any real chemo. So this nocebo effect could easily produce even a life-threatening illness. And it's even been, shown with some evidence that people can die from the nocebo effect, right, based on some curses in indigenous culture. So I think if we look at the combination of the nocebo effect, plus we didn't even mention the stress and disruption in people's lives at that time, that some of them may have, their businesses were suffering, they had to be around their addicted, abusive spouse who wasn't at the, working, and all of that kind of stuff. Plus, getting a totally different treatment and pathway in the hospital that was much more scary, right? Instead of, oh, let's keep you here, we'll do some tests, everything's going to be all right. Nope, let's get you to the ICU, right, where we know what percentage of people die in the ICU, like 40%, something like that, right? It creates a whole different situation. We're doing tests we never looked at before. We're looking at everything through a different lens. Every single one before they got to you got COVID tested, right, and had a result there. So there was like a bias about what was going on. You looked at them, observed them in a different way with more scrutiny, because you're like thinking, oh my God, there's some new thing. I got to figure this out, how to cure people. I got to not get sick myself. So all these factors put together, could easily create this. And so in order to know, we need more information, and we can match things up. And I know that, in certain places where there's a much higher early mortality in the hospitals, they were much more aggressive with ventilators and with experimental drugs, and doing things very differently. Like they were, paralyzing and sedating people who were, walking and talking.
Yeah. 3 liters of oxygen,
Right?
literally the first patient we had that was COVID positive, 3 liters of oxygen via nasal cannula intubated. Unbelievable. Historically, never. That is barely any oxygen.
Exactly. So it's really challenging to answer these questions, and but not to put aside that, like, you did observe unique things, but it's just that it's hard to know what's the exact reason for those unique things that you observed.
Yeah, and I don't discount that at
right?
all. The power of thought, I don't discount it at all. And I believe we're being intentionally confused. I think there's mass formation psychosis out there. This everything.
Absolutely.
It's hard to find truth. In fact, I've been saying lately that 2 + 2 = 4, and beyond that, it's hard to find truth. But honestly, Ontario Mathematics Coordinators Association says this math truth is no longer self-evident. They told social media followers that 2 + 2 = 4 is part of white Western mathematics that marginalizes other values. I mean, that is what we are facing in this world right now.
Well, if you, as soon as you said that, even before you read that quote, George Orwell came up in 1984, right? Because the key to that level of control is convincing people that they never know what the truth is, right? The truth is whatever they're told it is.
Yeah.
And that's a key tool of control. And, the woke agenda is preying upon people's emotions to introduce these kinds of elements. And it's very unfortunate, because I think most of the people that would be exposed to something and be influenced by that are well-meaning individuals, that they just don't realize that they're being brainwashed, because people never realize when they're being brainwashed. Otherwise, that once they realize it, they're no longer vulnerable to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you being a psychiatrist, that to me, what's happening in this world right now, when working with doctors who know early intubation, they know this, it's ridiculous. And the remdesivir, they have to know these things, but it seems as though the mass formation psychosis, that almost an entire population, their subconscious has been hijacked. I believe all the way this has been going on, I'm sure you agree, for decades, century. The Federal Reserve is a scam. Rockefeller's taking over medicine, all these medicines. I've known for years that statins are a big scam. Chemotherapy's a big scam. How does this, it is control, is it not? It's this attempt to control all of society.
Yeah, well, you see, and some of those things that you mentioned are actually tightly linked to this, because, you could see that there are these major events that happen, right, that have all these repercussions in other areas. I mean, 9/11 is a great example of that, right, because it allowed the passage of all kinds of legislation that wouldn't have been able to be passed beforehand, right, related to security and such. Of course, it was a boon for the military-industrial complex. But if we look, at the way the plandemic was handled, with shutting down everything, and especially disrupting supply chains, seemingly in key industries like in the food production, that these changes or economic sequelae, including quantitative easing, right? You talked about the Federal Reserve, so essentially they're creating more fiat currency out of most of it's digital. We say printing money, but them just creating increasing the quote unquote money supply during this is all contributing to the financial disaster, right, that is occurring right now, right? We have already bank failures, a lot of indication that the dollar is going to no longer be the world reserve currency, right? And this is going to be a bit of a disaster. And if it weren't for those financial policies that were based all upon lie and fraud, right, a psychological operation, then we wouldn't have those other things going on now. And also their ability to lock things down, shut them down, to control protests and use more militaristic measures to control dissent has allowed them to transition into doing tyrannical policies related to climate change, like we have in several countries, like in the Netherlands, is one that is more widely known about, where they're really trying to put farmers out of business, especially ranchers.
Yeah, so I'm going to back up one. Are you familiar with Dr. Zach Bush?
Yes.
So Dr. Bush, he talks about exosomes and how he actually, I think, predicted that we were going to have a pandemic. And I don't know where he stands on terrain versus germ theory. But his theory was that the world is so toxic with glyphosate. He actually predicted, I believe, in 2017 that we were going to have a pandemic that would start near Wuhan. And this theory that we are communicating with one another, obviously not you and I right now, but with exosomes. Do you have any comments on what is an exosome and like the mycelium in the forest, how trees communicate with one another through the mycelium? One might need some copper, one might need some other element, and they trade. Could exosomes be the mycelium of the animal kingdom?
Well, there's one, big difference between those two things is one that we have lots of scientific evidence that mycelium are intertwined with plants. But with exosomes, these are really just what we know about them is that they're breakdown products of dying cells. And, they look under the microscope, the electron microscope, exactly the same as what we're told are virus particles, right? So probably all of these particles, including the ones they say are viruses, are these kinds of exosomes or extracellular vesicles, which are just, like I said, breakdown products of damaged and dying cells. Now, do they have a function? We don't really know. It's really speculation and hypothesis. Certainly, based upon the contagion studies, right? Because we could find those products in secretions, in bodily secretions. They have been found, and in the blood and such. Like, actually, one thing that's really important to know about exosomes compared to viruses is they actually find exosomes in nature, like directly in a human body or in other animals. They don't have to do a simulation in a laboratory to create something that they can call an exosome. They can get it directly from the body, and they can purify them. So they get them just by themselves so they can examine what they're made of. And you can find published studies where they characterize exosomes in, individuals that have a certain disease. Like there's one, in so-called HIV patients, for example. Also not what it seems, but nonetheless, they found and purified the exosomes in these patients, but they couldn't find and purify the virus. They didn't even attempt it because they knew it would come up empty. But so they're real things, at least to some degree, because you can find them directly in nature. You can characterize them, purify them, see what they're made of, right? They're real. You can even sequence the genetics material out of there, and they've done this with many exosomes, and they found that the genetic material comes from, parts of our cells, like could be from the nucleus, could be from the mitochondria even. So they are real. Now, what their function is really not known. It's under investigation. There's a lot of research, but so they could be a mechanism of exchanging information between individuals, but we don't have direct evidence of that. But there also are many other ways that we could pass information, unspoken, right? It could be through radiation that comes off our body, like electromagnetic radiation, because we do produce an electric and magnetic field, right? That's how EKGs and EEGs work. They detect those fields, and they extend out about 6 feet from us, and the magnetic field is in a toroidal shape. So we interact with other beings, and our magnetic fields interact. So that could be it. We also have pheromones. And there are some studies with pheromones, and these are chemicals that are in our secretions, and different kinds of secretions may have more or less of them. And they also have been shown they can have an effect, obviously without communication. But we also, communicate by just visual means. We observe, someone else wearing a new fashion, and we never talk to them, but then we change our fashion to match theirs, right? I mean, that doesn't happen through an exosome or a pheromone or a magnetic field, right? It happens a different way. So there are lots of ways that organisms communicate with each other. We don't fully understand all these things, or what's communicated by which mechanism. And I think this would be a great area to explore. But I also think that we should need to be very, very cautious in how we understand what is what, that that we have opinions based on what evidence we really know. Even in terrain theory, like, I wouldn't even use that term anymore exactly. It's a little bit misleading because it includes many different theories underneath it. Like pleomorphic theory is one, and there's quite a substantial body of evidence behind that, right? The idea that there is a sort of a primordial bacteria, microbial stem cell kind of thing. It has different names, and that it can develop and change shape into different species of bacteria and yeast and fungi, right? But there's quite a bit of evidence for that. There's other things, like there's toxemia as a cause of disease, right? Like toxins, environmental toxins causing disease. And there's lots of evidence for that, especially with discrete toxins and illnesses, and now lots of more evidence of finding in tissues of people with illness, actually finding chemical toxins, or even microplastics in people with liver disease, finding it in their livers. So we do have, real evidence that we can look at that might explain some other problems. And, glyphosate is a good example. We know that it's toxic to many of the bacteria that live in our gut, right? So that means it's toxic to us, because we know those are a vital part of our entire organism, right? And then we can look at, well, what specifically, would it cause? But we've been exposed to glyphosate in high levels for quite a long time. It wouldn't just cause an acute pandemic to erupt, right? These chronic toxins cause chronic health conditions, not real. I mean, you can get an acute exposure to a toxin and have an acute reaction, right? But you got to just understand that when you have chronic low-level exposure, you have chronic toxicity, and when you have an acute, right, then you have acute. Now, the chronic one may, result in ultimately in cancer, and the cancer might take over the body and produce, death, which might be an acute illness, right, resulting in death. But really, you can trace it back for years and years, maybe decades, the whole course of the illness. And that's what I'm trying to differentiate. So everyone wouldn't suddenly, die of cancer at the same time. So I don't think that, there's any relationship there. But there could have been, you mentioned, for example, 5G. Now, we don't really know for sure what the direct health consequences of 5G would be, because we don't have the data. We know there's animal data that show a lot of toxicity, organ failure, kidney failure, bone marrow problems, et cetera, et cetera. So we could say, it's possible that there were some areas at that time where they, turned on 5G in a neighborhood, and then we could look, and all of a sudden a bunch of those people got pneumonia and went to the hospital. But we could easily find that data out. Like we could look at the date it was turned on, and then look at the hospital admissions or ICU occupancy before and after that event, right? And see if there's a signal. And then we can get further information. We could, go and look at the addresses of the patients in the ICU with pneumonia and say, were they in the neighborhood? What was their proximity to a 5G tower, right? If we find that the ones with the worst outcomes were closer to the towers, for example, that would be really strong epidemiologic data to say that there was a causal relationship going on. But we really need to look at evidence like that, and it's accessible out there to find out, because when we just see people get sick or people die, we can't ascertain the cause from that information alone. Now, sometimes it fits a pattern of known illness, right? Like we see someone loses their memory and they die 2 years later, and we can autopsy them and see specific things in their brain, neurofibrillary tangles, amyloid plaques, and know that they had Alzheimer's disease, right? Because we've already done the work to establish that, but no one can tell you the definitive cause of it, even though we recognize it as a unique and reproducible entity, right? So we need to have that evidence of causality, and it's largely missing from our experience of illness. But there's more and more data that's amassing, and it shows that toxicity really is the cause of many, many things.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And the power of suggestion, we know that, is extremely powerful. So when I search on the internet, viruses don't exist, one of the articles that came up is Steve Kirsch. Now, Steve Kirsch, he's been doing a lot of good work exposing a lot of these vaccine deaths and injuries. Apparently, he's trying to get a debate with people who believe in viruses and people who argue against that. And has there been a debate? Would you participate in a debate with a virologist, or is the science they're using just shoddy?
Well, let me tell you that I would love to have a debate with an actual virologist, like someone who publishes virology, not someone who claims to be a virologist but doesn't really understand even the basic virology research. So, Steve has done some important work, and he tried to, first, I don't know, about a year ago, he kind of challenged me and some other people in my circles to a debate, and we tried communicating and having, some basic ground rules to make sure that we didn't have it, some kind of shouting match or something that went off topic and didn't actually get to the important issue. Do viruses actually exist? What's the primary evidence? And he wasn't serious about it at that time, and eventually we just stopped communicating. And then his representative invited me to come on his podcast like about a month ago. And, I said, hey, why don't you, allow me to invite Tom Cowan and Mark Bailey to join me, and we'll present all of the reasons why viruses don't exist and lay it out clearly, for you. And at first, he said that would be great. But then he started trying to invite other folks to debate us. And it was clear when we had some discussions that the other folks, as well as Steve, they didn't even know what our arguments were. They hadn't even looked at the material that we put out, even though we provided it directly to them in a folder. And that further, when we asked them, what is your evidence that the virus is real? They gave us a paper or papers that virology itself didn't even do for that purpose. Like the paper, nowhere did it say here's the evidence that this virus exists. It was a paper that started with the assumption that the virus existed, and then was doing some diagnostic or genetic research. And so it was like they didn't even know what the virology community itself considers the standard to demonstrate a new virus. And so we couldn't have a productive discussion. And we kind of left it off that the three of us are going to produce a video where we just explain the basic reasoning, and then they can respond, in any way they see fit. And it might be interesting to see if they actually respond to what we put out. And so we're in the process of producing that video. But my whole goal is to just know what's true and what's not true. And anyone who also shares that and is serious about it, I'm more than willing to have a discussion or a debate if we differ, in opinion. As long as we come to the table and say, all right, here's the evidence, here's the logic, here's the reasoning, right? And we can discuss that and challenge it, where there are gaps. And if we come to the table like that, we're going to have a productive discussion, even if we don't change our mind and agree at the end, because people, like, of course, I had to change my mind because, as did you about this, because, I came up through all of the, doctor education where they say, of course, viruses are real. Their vaccines are the greatest miracle of modern medicine, et cetera. I had to change my mind about all that to get where I am. And that was just simply by looking at the evidence. When I took that initial position, I never looked at the evidence. I just was told that that's the truth, and I believed it. And everything I observed in my clinical experience, I just interpreted within the confines of that belief, because I said, well, this is the truth. I've told this since I was a tiny kid. But when I actually said, oh, let me look at the evidence for this, like back to the beginning, I found out it's simply not there, like that this is a made-up story for various purposes, and a lot of people are benefiting from it, but it's simply, there's no evidence for it, so it's not the truth.
Yeah, I mean, we've been lied to for, since the day I was born. The government's been lying to us, institutions have been lying to us, but since we're on the truth expedition here, would it be a true statement to say that a virus has never been isolated?
Well, I think we first have to just define what the term virus and what the term isolated means in order for me to answer that question without being misunderstood.
Right. Well, they say that they've isolated the COVID virus, but that's a computer algorithm, from my understanding, correct?
Well, so no, so let me just say first, the definition that I'm using for a virus is a replication competent particle. Okay, meaning it can reproduce, but not on its own. It needs a host cell, and it has a shell and it has genetic material inside. Right, the shell, I don't care what you want to say it's made from, if it's protein or phospholipids or whatever, it's just a container. And then there's genetic material, okay? So that's kind of the definition. And then the last part is that it causes a disease. So I'm not talking about exosomes. I'm not talking about bacteriophages, just, these particles that are alleged to cause a disease that can replicate, okay?
Yeah.
And I think it's important to distinguish these things. And then the rest of the question was, has one of those things been isolated? Well, no, there's never been, not even demonstrated, a particle that can do those things. Never been demonstrated. Now, the virologists do an experiment that they call a virus isolation, and that experiment has been done, where the problem is that they use their meaning of isolation is different from what we mean when we say isolate, like to get by itself. So you have to say, well, according to their definition, they did do this experiment, which they call a virus isolation. The only thing is, in the experiment, it's not even possible to demonstrate the existence of a virus from nature. Okay? Mm-hmm. So that's the first part. And then nothing was actually isolated, or better, sometimes use the word purify to be absolutely clear. But in other fields of science, when they use the word isolation, they mean purify. right? Like you isolate a chemical, a natural product out of a plant. That means you purified it. But it doesn't mean that in virus isolation. So it's a little bit tricky unless you know the definitions. But it's more clear, and this will be my last remark, but more clear to simply say that a disease-causing virus has never ever been found in nature.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at there. So I believe that to be true. And I also want viewers to understand if this is just too much for you to swallow, the work that Dr. Kaufman does when it comes to natural healing, what water is, how to keep fasting, how to eat healthy. The work that Dr. Kaufman's been doing there is extremely important. And I know we're running close to out of time here, but if you wouldn't mind just for a moment talking about water, I think what you tell people about water and the fourth phase of water is remarkable, and I think people need to hear that.
Sure. Well, I'll give you a little teaser, and if you look at my other material, you can find a lot more in-depth educational material, versus both free to the public and also some of my workshops on this, where I go into a lot of detail on this topic. But water is not what we think it is at all. It is not a passive universal solvent in the background. It actually takes on a very active role. There's a whole new science of water that has produced amazing discoveries about what it can do, and it actually is one of the major conductors of energy in our body. Like, energy comes sort of from the water. It's not the primary original source is the sun, but the sun's energy gets into the water in our body, and it carries out a lot of the function. And mainstream biology doesn't acknowledge this at all yet, although it actually comes from some mainstream biologists. And it's overturning many of the paradigms in biology, like, for example, the sodium-potassium membrane pump theory, and several others. And it's just key to health. And I've seen, personally, a massive problem with dehydration, and not enough water in the body to do the functions optimally that we need. Or the water in our body is not able to do it for other reasons. Like, this is probably one of the big ways that toxins cause disease, is through disrupting the function of the water. So, I'll just summarize by saying that water is probably the most important factor to health and biology, and it's completely been overlooked and misunderstood. And so if you want to learn more about that, and including practical ways which you can optimize your body's water for health purposes, and people have had amazing results doing this, please check out my website and my other platforms, which I'm sure you'll put in the links.
Yeah, absolutely. So they'll be in the show notes. It's andrewkaufmanmd.com. And check out the documentary which Dr. Kaufman participated in, called Terrain. It's on Apple TV. It's on Amazon and Tubi. Amazing information, and what a pleasure. I appreciate your time today, Dr. Kaufman. It has been an amazing conversation, and thank you so much.
Thank you as well.
Good? We good, Dawson? Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it so much. I have other cancer, all these other things, but I think the conversation about COVID and the psychosis and all that was just incredible, and thousands of people will see this, and thank you so much.
All right. Yeah, no, I'm glad you did it, and it's good to, review this material and summarize everything, as we're getting on to the next phase. And, feel free to invite me back if you want to talk more about natural healing topics or anything that we missed.
Yeah, absolutely. Like cilantro, I want to talk about your spagyric cilantro. How much cilantro would you have to eat to get a dropper full of, compared to a dropper full? Do you have any idea?
It's hard to really compare, to be honest. But I would, the amount you need to eat if you're eating fresh cilantro and do real metal detox, I think it would be unpleasant.
Right. I think it would be
It'd probably give you a tummy ache.
Yeah.
Because there's other stuff in the cilantro that's not very healthy, right? That's why with herbs we only eat them in small quantities, because if you had like made a salad of basil, you'd have pretty wicked tummy cramps after that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, the gut biome, so much more. So yeah, I'll invite you back. In a couple months. Again, the work you're doing is incredible, and we're going to open up a lot of eyes when people watch this, because my following is mainly, mainstream conservatives that have never heard of Dr. Kaufman. So a lot of eyes will be open.
Well, yeah, it's definitely going to be polarizing. Be prepared for some negative comments too.
Oh, that's fine. I mean, people need to at least have the food for thought and start asking their own questions, because we've been lied to. Big scam.
Absolutely. Agreed. All right. Well, you take care. It was great meeting with you.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Dr. Kaufman. Have a great day. Well, that was an incredible discussion I was just able to have with Dr. Kaufman. To tell you the truth, I was a little starstruck. So please do check the show notes. Search for the movie Terrain, the movie. Dr. Kaufman played a major role in the creation of that. It's an incredible catalog of information of what we talked about today, but talking about the Spanish flu, how viruses have never really been purified, and how much of what we're told is a lie. And it will help you get a little bit closer to understanding much of what we just talked about. AndrewKaufmanMD.com is his website. And again, I intended to have conversation about him, about natural healing, and I'll have Dr. Kaufman on again in a couple months. But the conversation we could have about water is incredible. What water is, the fourth phase actually is a gel. Talking about fasting. A lot of people here have heard of intermittent fasting, which is not eating for maybe 16, 18 hours out of the day and doing most of your eating in a 6-hour period. Dr. Kaufman talks about doing fasting for as long as 21 to even 30 days. Incredible, and how this can have life-changing effects and curing disease. And so Dr. Kaufman is just an incredible natural healer. He's so much information for everyone out there, beyond just this terrain theory concept. So please do follow Dr. Kaufman at his website, Andrew Kaufman MD, and continue to watch us on The Truth Expedition. Again, follow at rumble.com/The Truth Expedition, and we will see you next week.